Hi, welcome. I'm hoping this will in some way help you when you're preparing your lessenreeks for the ILS. It's just an extra in case you needed some extra information or to stop and think about it or didn't quite understand what was written on paper. Okay, here are some didactic questions which may help you with the initial planning of your lessenreeks. These are not lesson aims. They are just simply your starting point to sit down and think, right, what is it that I want to get out of this series of lessons? Here you'll see a number of aims I've used for a pretend lesson I'm going to do. The content aspect of these aims, i.e. the main topic of our lesson, is the past simple and the present perfect, as you'll see. The so-called behavioral aspects vary, and you can recognize those by the verbs used, such as know, explain, and describe. As you'll see, they're all cognitive aims and they differ in level of competence. So if we take a look a bit more closely at the individual aims, you'll see that the first aim, is productive and convergent. Because we're using example sentences, which therefore I, the teacher, have provided, it implies that it's convergent thinking, i.e. the person is good at bringing various sources together to bear on a problem in such a way as to produce the correct answer, but they are not themselves having to provide the examples or do the majority of the creative thinking. And here we have the second aim. As you'll see, this one is divergent, and that's because we don't actually know how the pupils will explain it unless they've learned it off by heart. In that case, it's actually reproductive rather than productive, and I'm aiming, of course, at productive skills here. Divergent implies the pupil's skill is used creatively. It's prompted by a stimulus. The third aim is also divergent. We don't actually know what the pupils will describe. These differences in ability, in levels of ability, the aims that I've had, the three aims, will actually influence all the other choices I make for my lesson. I haven't elaborated on the idea of divergent and convergent thinking, firstly because I'm presuming you've had that by algemene didactiek, and secondly because if you haven't, I'm sure a simple Google search will give you the answers. Right, we've thought about where we want to go with our lesson, what the main topic is going to be for our series of lessons. Then we need to think about where we're starting from. The various starting points and where I start from is going to influence my lesson choices, all the various choices involved in my lesson. As a teacher, for example, I need to make sure that I allow enough time for the pupils to complete the work during the lesson, after the lesson, etc., that I've got that all planned in. I need to think of the actual physical situation where the lessons are going to take place. I need to be able to know what the pupils already know about this topic, ask the teacher who's already taught this sort of a lesson, have a look in the books they may have had last year or earlier chapters. I also need to know about the class as a whole. There are going to be all sorts of different levels within the class, even perhaps taking into account if there's going to be a lot of reading involved, what sort of rules there are at school regarding dyslexia. Once I've thought about the initial starting point, where are we going to start the lesson, I do of course need to activate the pupils' prior knowledge. They will no doubt have an opinion, know something about the topic. Here are some various ideas that you can use to activate prior knowledge, but of course it also depends on what it is you want to know. Do you want them to simply be able to recognize the form, in this case of the past tense, or do I want them to do more with it? After I've activated the prior knowledge, I'll then move on to the learning activity. And that is also dependent on what type of thinking it is I want to activate by the pupils and which activities suit the thinking activity I want to do. I imagine these are familiar to you. Bloom's taxonomy and the book on from Evans and Etekova. For the actual learning activity, you could think of either or both Bloom and Evans and Etekova. Bloom's taxonomy refers simply to hierarchical thinking skills, starting at remembering and moving gradually, understanding, applying, etc., up to creating. Evans and Etekova have gone one step further. They've translated this into learning activities, which go from lower order thinking to higher order thinking. If we have a look on the next slide, I'll show you how we can translate this to the actual lesson aims that I had. Right, so taking a look at the lesson aims that I had, we'll remember that the children first of all had to recognize the form, herkennen. So we're starting with the very basic aim, onthouden en begrijpen, so the lower order thinking skills. For the third question here, the pupils are actually doing more than recognizing the form and moving towards the higher order thinking because they're explaining things. For the very last question, we're requiring a creative application. So as you can see, we've passed through all the thinking levels within this one simple lesson. It's not always going to be the same. They're not always in the same order. Some questions won't even be necessary, because by asking one question, the pupils may already be able to demonstrate the competence. So you may not have to ask the lower order skills, but it's wise to be prepared just in case. So we've already thought about the questions, and then after that we need to think of the actual work forms, activities in the class, but there's actually an awful lot more involved. For example, what is my role as a teacher? What am I doing while the pupils are, for example, doing their exercises? What is it physically that I'm doing in the class? And what is it that my pupils are doing? Am I expecting them to just sit and listen? Are they actively involved? Are they in pairs? Are they in groups? Are they walking around, etc.? Even more importantly, perhaps, is how can I actually see what they've learned? How will I know that they've learned what I've been trying to teach them and help them with? How also will I be able to see what I have learned? Have I achieved the aims that I had as a teacher trainee? In advance, I need to think about what input it is that the pupils may find difficult. You can always ask your SPD about this, and you can check through the books, and perhaps you already know from previous lessons what they find particularly difficult. And you need to therefore plan for perhaps some extra input. How can I make it even simpler for them to understand? Another aspect which people don't think of all the time is, do all the pupils need to do the same work? Or are there some pupils who can do some different type of work because the topic is perhaps too easy for them or too difficult for them, etc., etc. The evaluation part of a lesson, this is done per lesson, but also at the end of the series of lessons, is something which many people often forget. They are surprised by the bell. Please plan the evaluation. It's very important. If you have any questions, feel free to mail me about them, and otherwise I'm sure most of them, I hope, will be answered in class.